Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. Ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm rejoined by a returning guest. We got Dr. Brooke Bartlett. Thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me on again, Eric.
Of course, it couldn't have been that bad that you've returned. So if you all want to scroll back, which you probably will after listening to this episode, it's number 63. It's how to prep for trauma for first responders and family. Dr. Brooke, show notes will have her bio information. I don't want to go too much down into the weeds, but certainly an expert on trauma, stress related to first responders, moral injury, all kinds of things. But today we're going to be talking about something that's probably going to hit, certainly going to hit very hard in the feels. We're going to get all the feels because we're going to be talking about pet grief.
Yay!
Yeah. So, yeah, Brooke. So, I mean, this came out of you recently lost your dog, and we were messaging, and you've since been putting out stuff about pet grief, and that's certainly something that when it resonates with somebody, it resonates really in a big way. I mean, for many of us, our animals, our dogs, cats, etc., horses, pigs, are very much like a part of our families, a part of us. I mean, it's a big thing for me. I'm very much a dog person. Having to put down dogs is like probably one of the worst things I've had to endure, and that's also considering that I've endured some pretty traumatic things from 16 plus years of police work and observing really traumatic things. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We got messaging about it and kind of talking about how we could definitely see this being a helpful conversation for a lot of folks.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about it, even though it's a pretty difficult conversation. But I think it's really important to talk about. It's really interesting. I call it the disenfranchised form of grief, because I feel like a lot of people. I've heard a lot of people, and I actually experienced this as well, is almost like it's just not taken as seriously as the loss of a human. And I'm saying generally speaking, like societally. And I just, it's such an intense form of grief for individuals who have lost a dear pet. And for some, including myself, truly like the highest form of grief. I mean, there's a handful of humans in my life that I would elicit the same level or more grief, but it's a small pool. So yeah.
And it's a lot, and I think that you're gonna have, I think like anything these days, people are gonna take something and potentially polarize it, but I think a lot of people listening can relate to the fact that even for first responders, a lot of people have mentioned how hard it is seeing an animal suffering versus, this might sound terrible, so bear with me, but sometimes the people that we see in not so ideal situations outside of kids had some hand to play in it. Like they had choices that may have led them one way or another, which is not to disparage, but we do have a soft spot for animals because especially our own pets, like they're very much dependent on us. And I think that adds to a layer of how they integrate with the family. And also they just become kind of like a fixture. And I don't mean like a piece of furniture, but like very much like an integral part of our lives. And when I think about the reasons and some of the things that I connect with emotionally to like my past pets, my dogs, it's recognizing that they're kind of a constant for a certain number of years, like in all these really big things in your life, some involving them, some they're kind of in the periphery, but it's a different form of like, I guess, memory association, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research coming out right now. I mean, showing the impact, the physiological impact, and the neural impact that, let's say, a dog has on us. Right? I mean, it actually physiologically impacts us differently in a way that, generally speaking, like having a human that you're used to stand next to you doesn't necessarily elicit that same physiological response. But looking at your dog, petting your dog actually releases chemicals, that are associated with improved mood, etc. So it's more than just feelings. It's actually like we're feeling that way, and we're feeling that connectedness in a way because they're capable of connecting to us in ways that humans aren't.
Yeah. And we are talking about that. You're talking about the literal like oxytocin boost that
Mhm,
a lot of people have heard about, right? Like that's why we embrace our loved ones. That's why we hug. We actually get
mhm.
a chemical response that influences our health. And there are studies that indicate that you can get that from cuddling with your dog, from
Yep,
petting your dog, right? Like interacting with this very loving, caring uh, living creature, right?
yep, exactly. Yeah, and I wanted to comment on something you were saying. I mean, so as Eric was saying, I specialize in working with public safety, and I can tell you, I've worked with a lot of public safety professionals whose worst traumas that they come in to see me for are associated with things that they've seen associated with animals.
Mm.
Um, and it comes with a lot of like embarrassment and shame. And a lot of them have talked to me about how they don't feel comfortable talking about it, or how they fear being negatively judged for a lot of different things. One, how could you care more about the dog that you saw burning alive in a car than the person who's dead on the side of the road? Or they're worried that they'll be chastised by other people in their crew, for being that affected by it. But it's pretty common that I come across that and hear about that. That those incidents are extremely impactful.
Yeah. And I'll just kind of spin off on something I said earlier where I was talking about, why some adults have done certain things that might influence where they are in life. I think that we can reasonably say that that's just a cause and effect thing of just how life goes. But I want to clarify in case people think that I'm just like really cold and abrasive. I'm not trying to say like people that are in really poor living conditions, it's their fault. I'm trying to say that when I said that, what kind of popped into mind that you kind of jogged my memory on is like I've shot animals at work, and that was pretty terrible. One was a pit bull that was essentially like through the night, like generating these aggressive dog calls. Like a couple people almost got bit. I almost got bit earlier in the night trying to corral this dog, and in the end, when I went out, like very late in the night, this is hours of this dog call kind of popping up throughout a whole sector. This dog was covering a lot of ground, like miles and miles. Finally, when I got out of my car, the dog charged me, and I remember just being this kind of like, oh f, like I kind of stuck in this position now. And I remember having a lot of heartache over like hitting it, which in hindsight, I wonder if I actually dipped my barrel because I didn't really want to hit it, but I clipped him in the paw, like the front paw. So you think about how like nominally off that is. Um, but it kind of limped away, and I was happy that I didn't have to, kill it. And then we got a dog pull and an animal control officer there to corral it. I didn't want to find out what happened to it. It's probably not a positive ending for that dog because he was so people aggressive. Um, but I've also shared many times that I've been in an officer involved shooting with a suspect that tried to ambush us. And while I'm not upset, and that might be the wrong word, but I don't have a lot of negative feelings towards that person as a human being. I am bummed out that I had to be involved with that, and that's the end course of his life. But I didn't have as much heartache, and people might think that that makes me a terrible person. I'm just sharing what it is, and I've heard a lot of cops have similar anecdotes of having to use force on people versus like an aggressive dog. And I think that that just plays into kind of what you're saying was like with the dog, I don't think it's the dog's fault that it had poor training and no one to take care of and love and uh, put it in the right positions, right?
Mhm.
The dog may have very well been trained to be a dog fighter and a people fighter, and that's just really unfortunate.
I mean, I think this is why we wanted to have this episode, right? I mean, because you've said multiple times, I mean, you may think I'm a terrible person for saying
Mm.
this, right? I mean,
Hmm.
that's exactly what I'm talking about,
That's the
right?
stuff, right?
That's the thing that keeps, that I've seen many of the first responders I've worked with, that have kind of kept that inside because they're worried that people are gonna think that they're a terrible person. And so I think again that just reiterates why it's really important we're talking about this.
Yeah, I'm like preemptively buffering this shame, like a shame cushion. Like,
Yep.
yeah, go ahead and like shoot the arrows. I'm just gonna own it. But like most of the conversations we have on here is like because I'm a person, but I recognize a lot of these conversations I've had with a lot of people is that like it's just a thing, right? And it's like these are human reactions. We're all humans doing the best we can. If you're listening to Blue Grit Radio, you're doing the best you can. So, but yeah, even like people that have to like dispatch a deer that's been hit by a car, like
Yeah.
yeah, it doesn't mean that they're not a meat eater or that they don't hunt. They just don't like being in that situation where they have to that some an animal's in pain. And
Mm-mm.
to rewind back to or kind of bring it back to our main focus is talking about pets as family members. It's like that is really hard to see, a being that we've been integrated with for however many years, like 5, 10, 15 years, and then to see them declining and see them suffering. That's really hard. And it's, where I think we can all recognize that there's, whether it's been ourselves or people close to us, are you holding on too long? This whole thing, like, is the dog suffering or, is the dog happy just to be with us and medicated and limping around? Like, I think I've had opinions on that before, but I think just like most things, it's really hard to um and inappropriate to place judgment in like 99.999% of the time.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a complex aspect, and it is a uniquely terrible um, position, that a person or family gets put in. It's different than humans, right? Meaning, like when dogs decline, they typically decline very quickly, right? When it's time to go, and you know, it's very rare that I hear about someone's dog naturally dying. Just
Mm.
naturally dying. And in most cases, someone has to make that terrible decision to, you know, put their dog, you know, put their dog down. And that is it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how bad off your dog is. It's not easier, it's not easier at all.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder how much of that is because like again, they're so dependent on us, like that
Hmm.
their lifestyle is a result of our lifestyle, what we choose for them, like how active they are oftentimes, or what medications and when and how to feed.
Yep.
And so I wonder, as opposed to a loved one, and like a lot of us have experienced losing loved ones. Let's just make it like an elderly medical thing, right? The elders in our lives, but they have a strong vote. They have a bigger vote than you, right?
Yeah.
How they want to navigate treatment and stuff like that. They could talk about it. Whereas like you're looking at your dog and you're trying to get the science, you're trying to interpret, and so I mean that's what makes it so hard. And I've certainly have reflected on that, with our own aging lab. That was like he lasted a lot longer than we thought, and then it was just tough. Like literally day to day, you're wondering, is this the day? Is this the week?
Yep.
Um, it seems to be doing great, and I wonder how much that's like rose-colored glasses because you want it to work out well. Um, yeah, and I'll say this is like looking back at some photos of like his last days, like he did not look good. And I even wonder like was I being selfish, right? Was I holding on to this too long, trying to make up some narrative or fabrication? Like what are your thoughts on that on a professional level? With someone that's reflecting on that kind of thing, whether they're coming up on it or whether the time is now past.
Yeah, I mean, I hear that sentiment a lot. Um, and I hear, again, it's usually internalized negatively with like, I was selfish and oh my God, I put my dog through more than they should have, right? And then it leads to more guilt, etc. And, again, it's an incredibly complex situation. And the aspect of our dog not being able to talk to us, right? And tell us what's going on. Yeah, when we have, again, something, again, I'm going to speak for myself, it's more than just a pet. Like, this is part of part of my soul, right? I mean, you don't just look at them and say, "Oh, yep, looks like they're done." Yeah, that's it, right? I mean, it's just it's there's so many complex factors that go into it. So, especially when you have a situation with a slowly deteriorating dog, right? Or you get a terminal diagnosis, but they're not at that point yet, and you have to watch it happen. And it's like, when's it going to happen? I mean, it's not as easy as, yeah, of course, all those emotions have a major toll at that time when you're trying to decide when's the right time. So I hear that sentiment a lot of like, I think I kept my dog around for too long. But that all that guilt and shame, our brain is wired to try and find an explanation for these things. And unfortunately, a survival mechanism is sometimes it kind of turns to, what did I do wrong so I don't do this again? And I think that's a big part of what happens.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember having so many, like, kinda guardrails, that I could reflect on because I'd see other people, like, in my circles or whatnot, like, how they were handling their aging dog, having to put down other people's dogs because just I was, like, I've been that person for, like, an ex-girlfriend's family, but, even for, like, looking at my lab, like Jackson, I was like, "Okay, if he can't if he can't hold it, if he can't walk up the stairs, like, then we're done." And then so to never, like, get to that point, it became more and more, like, difficult, right? It was always
Mhm.
just a little shaky, but he's, like, doing fine. He's, like, waddling around and seems content. He still wants to be near us, so, like, you rationalize these things, but I like how you put that out is to kinda help people, recognize, like, some of the very complicated feelings um, that are happening. And so I'll share this, like, and I do want to talk about my canine as well. Not to make it the me show, but I wonder if there's could be applications for people. And I don't want to put you on the spot because before we start recording, you're like, okay, here we go. But yeah, with my lab, like I don't know if there's ever like a being to that moment that I loved to the extent of like loving my lab. I got him as a puppy, as an adult, but I was like the kid that always wanted a dog that never could. And then as an adult, like, well, I'm a grown man. I'll make grown man choices and I'll get this dog. But so many things, like, again, like kind of talking about what I was trying to articulate earlier, is like so many things happened through the course of Jackson's life, like where he was like co-pilot, right?
Mhm.
Certainly love my immediate family growing up, but like I didn't have to take care of my immediate family, right? I was the youngest kid, and then ultimately like having this puppy, and going through, taking him to surgery like early on because he's a lab and he ate like a pop can and
Sounds about
a
right.
bunch of garbage. Like how many times he went to the vet, I don't know how many thousands of dollars I spent with and without insurance, and a lot of people can relate to that. But um, yeah, thinking that he ate like actual shrapnel and having to wonder if he was going to make it. The emotional tolls there, but then also, like he was there for me and my now wife, like
Mhm.
through our relationship growing, and so he's like a fixture of that family, growing. And then he was there with my daughter, who's now 5, which is crazy. To the point where she was, coming up to like toddlerhood and like climbing on him. He was just like that patient kind of nana type,
Mhm.
old dog. And so like it's not just like the relationship that I had with my dog that was like finally this archetypical like boy with a dog going through the woods and going on trips and like in the river and all these things, that was almost something that I wanted my whole life. But
Yeah.
also like he was there through all the hard times, and like me and my wife having issues like building our family, like with fertility. So all these things are like really huge highs and lows that
Mhm.
a lot of times like our dogs can be like our constant. And I wonder how much more that becomes like a loss of yourself because they're very much a part of those memories and those experiences.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I know I experienced, that's my personal experience or the sentiment, how I explain it, but I've heard a lot of people, other people explain it like that, like they've lost a piece of themselves. Because not only, like you're using the word constant, and that's exactly what it is. I mean, like we're talking about dogs a lot, and I guess that's that I have dogs, you know. I mean, I like
Hmm.
cats too, don't get me wrong, but I have
Yeah.
a dog, I have dogs. But I mean, no matter what, that dog is a constant. The dog doesn't get mad at you. The dog doesn't, have bad days. The
Hmm.
dog doesn't, I mean, the dog is always there, and like even my fiance, who's just the most incredible man ever, and we have a wonderful relationship, we're all human, right? And
Yeah.
so if I'm being shitty to him or like I'm in a bad mood, he's always very patient and kind, but like my dog will always be there, no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I'm snapping at my dog because he's barking and I'm annoyed, like he just is like, "I'm sorry, like how can I please
Yeah.
you?" Like I'm
Yeah.
so sorry about that, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's another form. I mean, that unconditional love. I mean, it's a truly a form of unconditional love that I think that, again, I'm speaking personally, that I don't think any human is capable of. I think humans are capable of a different kind of love that dogs can't even give us, right? But it's a different kind of pure,
Hmm.
unconditional, constant, unwavering love and support. And when that's gone, like you feel it. And I mean, I've said this, when my dog passed recently a few months ago, and I can feel him not being there. Like
Hmm.
even just him sleeping, like he's not there anymore.
Yep. It
And you
feels weird,
feel it.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I
like
mean,
eerie.
it is, and it's like I'm not like a super hippy dippy holistic person, but I'm use the word energy. Like it's
Hmm.
like you can feel that energy not there anymore.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating thing. That emptiness that you feel.
Yeah. And yeah, that 100%. And you don't have to be wooed to recognize energy. Just like think about the person that you like seeing at work walk into the room and the person you don't like at work. They don't have to say a damn thing, right? But
Exactly.
that energy is real, and I think that a lot of what you're talking to, Brooke, is that unconditionalness, and that it gets labeled as loyalty a lot of times. That's where we get like man's best friend, just like all reliable, like dependable, always there, right? And we talked a little bit about shame and judgment earlier in one context, but like you never feel shamed or judged by your dog. I mean, maybe there's some goofy dogs that do a little side eye, like judgy eyes and stuff like
Yeah.
that,
My
but
dog
like,
Rocky did that. He was the
yeah.
master side eye.
Yeah, but, like, ultimately, even though, you talk about your fiance, or, like, I'll talk about my wife or some of my best friends, like, there's people that I 100% can rely on in any time of need,
Mhm.
but I may not, like, choose to open that door. Like, if I get home at 2 in the morning,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna just, like, wake up my wife to, like, talk about something. I mean, I could. I'm not disparaging anyone that chooses to, but I just might be in the moment, but, like, dog kinda saunters over and, like,
Yep.
throws his head on me because he can sense my energy, like, and I, just kinda cuddle and nuzzle, like, that's so, like, restorative, and that's such a this open kind of it's a one directional love whether you, like, give it, like, back or not, which is also the terrible thing that we see kinda going back to animal cruelty is, like, I mean, they're gonna be there,
Yep.
and it'll take a lot for them to even, like, snap back,
Yep.
um but just credence to how much they do give. Um, yeah, there's certainly nothing like it that I've ever experienced.
100%. And yeah, you're saying that one directional love, and this is pretty, and this is again a generalization among just characteristics in the first responders, public safety, and military that I work with, and of me. I mean, I work with public safety and first responders because I have some similar characteristics emotionally. But I tend to turn inwards to myself if I'm really stressed and whatnot, and sometimes can box out like my fiance, because that's just how I handle things, right? Oh, I got this. I handle it myself, and might kind of close off a little bit more, even if I don't really realize I'm doing it. but my dog is the only one that I let in. Like, and it's not even a conscious thing, but like my dogs are the only ones that, like, even in those times I realize that I'm leaning on them even if I'm not allowing my fiance to support me, because he's always willing to support me. It's more so of like, am I allowing him to? But my dogs, like, they're there,
Hmm.
it's different. And like I said, that's personally for me, but I've also heard a similar sentiment among some of the public safety that I've worked with, is, having difficulty knowing how to connect emotionally with, partners and kids, etc. But they're able to have that connection with their pet, with their dog.
Yeah, I wonder. It's like just overthinking, like with not knowing how to connect with your people, like your family, is like, how do I say? What do I say? Where do I start? Whereas like all you got to do with the dog is just like show up or just be there, right? Like it'll usually like the dog will come over to you, and there's not a whole lot more you got to do. Just like pet it, right?
Yeah, and they know, like,
Hmm.
you don't need to say anything. They know.
Yeah,
They can sense it. It's incredible what they can sense.
yeah. Have you talked much with people that have worked with working dogs, like canine military and police?
Yeah, I've worked, I mean, I've done therapy with several.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, sharing this, hopefully it'll help with like those that are gonna work canine or are working canine, maybe they have, but there's so many complicated emotions with canine work. And specifically, like, for sure, anyone with like a detection dog, you're spending like all day at work and all day at home, kind of like they're part of your lives in a special way. But for my experience, like Kato was a generalist dog, so a tracking dog that could perceivably get into use of force and receive force back, right? And he had been stabbed and he had been shot at. We'd been shot at together, almost exploded, and had some minor burns. And so that was a lot. Certainly like our career looking back and all the danger that he was subjected to. But in some ways, like was always cognizant of the danger that I was subjecting him to, right? Or the department was, but then I also had like a role in that. And so, we talk about guilt, but I remember like for years and years, I called him the work dog, and I kept him outside, and that's partially because of like drive and separating a little bit of like home life and stuff. But I felt maybe that because there was so much I couldn't control, I was trying to put these walls up where I didn't want him to be my dog until it
Mhm,
became years and years in where it was like like there was no point in not saying it.
mhm,
And I also felt like there was always a risk of like him being taken away,
mhm,
like what if I mess up at work and like I can lose him, and so he's not my dog, because he was truly not, like he was the department's dog.
mhm.
Are those things that have come up in your experience, like with the different people you've talked to?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, and it's a protective mechanism, right? I
Hmm.
mean, it's an attempt to protect, okay, if I can try and put a little bit of space emotionally between me and my canine, then maybe it won't hurt as much if they're not there anymore, right? And so yeah, it's a pretty common thing that I've heard. And yeah, it's very much a protective mechanism.
Yeah, and I wonder how much that is like for a lot of handlers, is that sometimes you're out and it's not even like the suspect, but he almost got hit by a car. I had to let go of the lead because he bolted across the street on scent, and I wasn't ready for it. But it was very much like a Jesus take the wheel moment as I like let go and cringed, and then the car like ran over the long lead and kicked it up in the air, which showed how close we were both to getting hit at a pretty high speed. Um, and that was my fault, right? But at the same time, like I remember that specific call, and we had enough to track for this person in a domestic dispute. But truly, like the injuries weren't significant,
Mhm,
and truly, like I remember clearly, like neither, like the other party, the reporting party that was there with the other officers, like didn't really want us to do a whole lot. And so, where the climate these days would be probably very different, it'd be like, okay, we're not going to pull out a tracking dog for this, but it was such that like law is stated such a way that like you will make every reasonable attempt to locate this person. And so I remember being so frustrated with systems and just the whole circumstance of like no one even wants us here, and like I almost lost my dog over this.
Mhm.
So that's like a lot to grapple with when you're putting your dog out there, and at the same time you recognize like they are in some role to protect you and other officers, which is like very noble and very appreciated. But then it's also to protect the community at large, and some care and some don't, and that's a sticky point too. I think to explain part of why we may develop these defensive narratives and posturing to insulate us from the pain of potentially losing them.
Yeah, absolutely. And another aspect, and I don't know if this was, this is relatable to you, but I've heard of just almost that, you being responsible, the handler being responsible for the canine, right? And that is even a deeper level that complicates it, meaning like if something happens to it and the emotional experience afterwards, right, is that
Hmm.
I am responsible for the well-being of this canine, and I'm also the one who, like, I put this canine in harm's way, right? Because it's part of the job.
Yeah.
But that's another level, that level of responsibility, and so that also leads to. I've worked with a lot of public safety and handlers that have reported significant grief after losing their canine in the line of duty, and that's that layer of like that they were my responsibility,
Hmm.
and even if the objective facts were such that there was nothing that they could have done, like they didn't do anything wrong, there's still that added layer, and so that could also kind of go into that defensive mechanism and that attempt to just kind of, okay, this is my work dog, like this work, this is my job, this is my job, this is the dog's job, and it is work.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's so many layers there, right? Sometimes there's tactics, sometimes there's decision making, and sometimes like the suspect has a vote too. And I think that that's always helpful to remind cops in general. Is like when bad things happen, and we can feel this moral injury, we can feel this guilt. Um, we didn't cause the large majority of the things. Like we didn't cause the call that we responded to, and I think that is a helpful thing to inject back in. Is like I certainly recognize that even the example I just painted, like had I been more attuned to my surroundings and handling the lead better, like we probably wouldn't have been in that situation. I would have just held him up at the sidewalk. But it happened, and fortunately for me, it didn't turn into something else. Right? Fortunately, I weren't hit. Um, there's definitely been a lot of close calls with Kato that me and my wife joked that he had 9 lives, and I could basically count him up. And I think that the ruptured spleen that happened at home when my wife is working at home in his retirement, like that was like the last one, because he had so many significant things, some that I rattled off. But I think that for myself, like it was easier to process because one, he had so many close calls, and two,
Mhm.
he made it to retirement, so I felt like emotionally and mentally good about that.
Mhm.
But also I was really, man, for years I would even verbalize it. I'd be so worried about what his aging process would be like in retirement. Like I was actually pretty assumptive that he'd make it, because he was so dang stubborn in some ways, and circumstance kind of played that way, kind of poetically. But I remember, like, I mean, you see a lot of canines that make it to retirement, like their joints are battered, and they just don't do well. And so I, maybe because I, in that chapter of life, I was very focused on intentional gratitude, that I was really grateful for the time we had. I was really grateful that he didn't have that really like very painful decline, I suppose, that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, you said his spleen ruptured. Did he have hemangiosarcoma?
I don't know. It wasn't diagnosed. So, in and this is part of the thing. Like I was at work, and I was working as a patrol sergeant since I'd promoted. We retired him because he was like old enough. I think he was like about 8. So they let me keep him, as a lot of departments would do. And yeah, basically he had like a seizure, and my wife
Mhm,
like saw the whole thing, fortunately, and so she rushed out to him. He's kind of out of sorts, and I hit up my counterpart sergeant. He's like, "Go, like, get out of here." And
mhm,
I was trying to like keep it together, and just new sergeant and all that. And I was like, "Hey, I think Kato's having something," but um, yeah, I'm like 99% sure it was Sergeant Joe Gagner. Shout out to Joe Gagner, an earlier episode. But he's just like, "Get out of here." So just driving home in uniform,
Mhm.
and then scooping him up and knowing that something is like terrible. But I had kind of also prepared my mind that I wasn't going to. I think he was like 10 or so. Um, I wasn't going to put him in through any really traumatic, I suppose, treatments,
Mhm.
because of what he had gone through in life and stress. And that was a kind of in the back of my mind decision. And so when I took him into the vet, they said that he'd lost a lot of blood, and there could be an opportunity. But as soon as he said "but," I just started shaking my head. I was like, "No, like I'm
Yeah.
not gonna put him through a lot to potentially have a sliver of a chance of, not ideal situation." So, I made the decision kind of right there,
Yeah.
and I tell part of the story because I anticipated maybe talking about it, but I think as much as we are generally really experts at compartmentalizing because the job requires it, like I actually thought about this. I have these weird thoughts sometimes. I think we all do, but I had this thought that since I was taking him into the vet's office, I'd probably like be fine because I was in uniform. I was like, I would, was still in uniform with my whole gun belt on, my vest, and I just went in like our personal car and just scooped him up and took him to the vet. Um, and I just perceived that like I would probably have this huge emotional dump when I got home. But then like in the back office, like I was a wreck. Like I can't that's probably like one top 5 times I've like cried so hard in full uniform, which just like boggled my mind. But I remember having that moment where I was like kind of just surprised, I suppose. Like I wasn't ashamed. Um it really gave zero shits about what anyone thought. And the vet was awesome. The office was awesome. Um but yeah, I just remember being like just so surprised that I tell the story because it's that amount of emotion that could overcome the stoic face nature that we could have at
Mhm.
work, literally being just on shift and then wearing the full uniform where you're kind of a superhero that's kind of invincible at times. But yeah, just how overwhelming that was.
Yeah. I mean, I mean, that type of emotion, it's primal, right? I mean, no amount of no uniform, no amount of logic, like
Mm,
that was just such deep primal emotion, that it just comes out like the floodgates. It's not something that primal type of emotion is not something that can be, we'll call it, controlled, right? And so yeah, I asked about that because with my dog who recently passed, it was a unique experience in dog loss because he was still healthy and in the middle of
mm,
his life and was supposed to have 5-6 years left. I have another dog who's snoring next to me right now, and she's had, when I say she's had health problems her whole life, like an insane number of health problems. I adopted her as an adult, but she's probably around 12 years old now. So but the fact that he passed away before her is just like, she was the one we thought was going to be the one we'd have to say goodbye to. So but he had his major organs ruptured. And again, just totally normal, healthy dog, didn't have any signs or symptoms. It was actually my fiance's birthday weekend. I'd flown his parents in as a
ugh,
surprise. We had all this stuff going on, and he was all excited in the morning, took him out for his walk, and we left for a few hours and came back, and he wouldn't get up. And he's an Aussie. He was an Aussie, and that's not normal. And we called the vet, and of course it was like 5 p.m. on a Friday. So, and they were about to close, and she said, "Look at his gums," and they were white.
mm,
She said, "You got to take him to the ER immediately." And then at that time we're still like, "Okay, this isn't good," but we're not. Our brain isn't even going
yeah.
anywhere like that
Hmm.
because again, he's young and healthy. I mean, he had just turned 9, but their lifespans are like 14, 15 years. Um, And we took him into the ER, and they immediately like rushed him back because they looked at his gums, and they came out and they had shaved his stomach, and he was bleeding out. He had blood. He was just fully bleeding out. And yeah, he ended up having hemangiosarcoma, which is, they call it the silent killer,
Hmm.
because the dog's completely normal, and then their organs burst. So yeah, we decided, yeah, this wasn't okay. There, she was like, "We could put him on a bunch of meds and maybe he'll live a few weeks." And nah, we're not doing
Mm,
that. I mean, this was very clear. So we hopped him up enough to where we could take him home that day because we wanted to put him down at home. So we had a home
Mhm.
euthanasia vet come, but it was a very I'd never experienced that before in dog loss because it was so sudden and it was so unexpected. Again, it's going to be a whole other thing with my other dog and a whole other pain as well. But if this had happened to her, I wouldn't have had the same shock, and it was just
Yeah.
pure shock that I
Yeah.
experienced and had a lot of symptoms of acute stress afterwards, like violent nightmares about him. I wanted to avoid anything and everything that reminded me of him.
Mm.
Significant guilt, even though like he was about to die. He probably wouldn't have made it overnight if we had left him, but like something like my brain is trying to make, sense of it, and it just turned to guilt. And it was a really really tough. I took the week off of work, canceled all my appointments. I mean, for the first couple days, I mean, I was literally just like it was like hazy. Like the world around me was hazy. I mean, it was just very different than my other experience of, which is also extremely painful, but different type of pain of like, slowly watching your dog go away. I mean, this was just so sudden, and it really hit a different kind of way. And so, even like we were talking about, people feeling guilt about when do they put the dog down, even with this very objectively, there is no option. Like the doctor wasn't even like, you can do surgery. They were like, no, he's going to die very
Mhm.
soon. And my brain still was like, I should have done this or I should have done that, or like I let him down, or, all these different things. And it's just in the aftermath of that kind of loss, it's very common to experience all these different emotions from shock to like, um, to, anger, to guilt. And, yeah, anyways, that's kind of my story, but I want the listeners to know that it's very, very common to experience an array of different emotions in the aftermath of losing a beloved pet. It is grief, right? I mean, there's a lot of symptoms that come along with that. And I think, again, society expects, oh, you go to work, I lost my dog. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Anyways, did you get that memo about blah, blah, blah? Now, if you said, my, my mother passed away, I think it's handled a little bit different, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
But it's just not necessarily viewed the same way, particularly about with from people who don't have pets, as other types of loss.
Yeah. No, that's such a good point. And on that note, like a lot of us, like we have our close friends that we make fun of. We're like, oh, their dog's their baby. But like for some people, it truly is like the closest thing, or like essentially a substitute of that level of care and love. And so like all the more reason to recognize like the gravity of that loss, right?
Mhm.
And like not place judgment and like allow that grace in ourselves and like those around us, because everyone's life is different, right? And like, man, even think about like COVID, like how much we were talking about just that social interaction, like how much like people's pets were like elevated to that level, like the
Mhm.
next level of importance, because you were like had such limited, a lot of people had such limited human interaction.
Mhm.
And like we're having a fantastic conversation, but it's like Zoom-esque, like it's different, right? Because you don't get that energy in person. So um and one part I want to circle back to is like when you're talking about avoidance. And by the way, I really appreciate you sharing. I do think that story and your share is like very helpful. Again, I wasn't going to put you on the spot, but very helpful example. But when you say like you're trying to avoid reminders, like the first thing that popped in my mind was like that's got to be really hard when it's your your dog that you lived with and you did things with. And so like avoiding things is like, is that avoiding home? Is that avoiding going outside? All these
No,
like
exactly, it
really
was avoiding
integral
home.
things.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
me, it was avoiding home. And so so I'm a trauma psychologist, right? And this is considered a trauma, right? I mean, this is a traumatic experience, all of it, right?
Hmm.
This the suddenness of it, having to witness them pass away, and all that, the all of it. But um, it's very common in the aftermath of a major event like this, a major loss like this, is to want to avoid things that remind you of it, right? And I'm going to really, really stress this: is that avoidance is a short-term solution that leads to long-term suffering. Um, it really does complicate and worsen the issue in the long term. It is a natural human instinct to want to avoid suffering and pain, but suffering and pain is evolutionarily wired in us. It is not only important, but it's necessary for optimal functioning, right? So in the aftermath of my dog dying, I like didn't want to be home. And like I felt the only semblance of slight relief in the first few days after. Like I went for a hike and I went outside and then I would just dread going home. And at one point, like a couple days after, we walked back in and my fiance lit the candle that we had lit when we put him down in the living room, and I
Mm,
couldn't I didn't e before a thought could even come in my mind, my body started shaking, and I just
mm,
burst out crying, and my body started shaking, and, like, he had no idea why, and I was like, the candle," and I was like, "You gotta get rid of the candle." Um, but I had to really, really, with the support, of course, of my fiance, and he was really struggling as well, we really leaned on each other, but, um, fight that urge to avoid being at home, avoid those things that caused a lot of pain. And unfortunately, the what needs to happen to actually process through these things is like to actually feel that pain, which isn't fun, obviously, but allowing yourself to feel that pain, allowing yourself to cry when you need to cry and to talk about it. I did what I could with my fiance. I would say, I feel really guilty. I feel like I let him down, and have him kind of be a soundboard and like talk through it so that I don't latch onto those thoughts and hold them in and then let them fester and fester and fester. And so those are aspects of trauma processing in general, whether it be a dog loss or whatever else it is. But that avoidance is pretty common, or that desire to avoid is pretty common in the aftermath of something like this.
yeah, no, that's a huge thing to reflect on, and like, there's so many ways that can take hold, and like, yeah, the example of the candle so huge, right? Because I think most people have heard how um how much like scent, right, and
Mhm,
odor can be internalized as our memories, or bringing up memories, and so that's super significant. And it's something I've talked about before, like just hypotheticals with friends, and like, man, what would be worse? It's always like a cynical mind to ask like what would be worse, but like, yeah, what would be worse, like a sudden loss of a pet, or like, or the slow decline, right? We've spoken to both, and I think that the the takeaways are it's all terrible, right? And like recognizing that certain personalities may like perceive one's like easier, like almost like the morning is longer drawn out for scene, but it's all tough, right? And so it's just recognizing like to to just like any kind of trauma, like we got to acknowledge it, right? And then we could potentially like focus on some takeaways that you would encourage the listeners to think about, because as you brought up, like this is a trauma, this is a traumatic experience.
mhm. Yeah, I think some of the takeaways would be, one, it's normal to experience a lot of difficult emotions afterwards. Like I said, it could be an array of things. Shock, anger is very common, um, guilt, obviously sadness, but I think in the aftermath, it's pretty common to have like the shock and the anger and the guilt. And for it's normal for this to be difficult, right? The expectation is not to, okay, my dog died and a week later I should be okay, or 2 weeks later I should be okay. I mean, I'm a few months in and I have truly not gone one day without crying, and it's okay. Like it's healthy. There'll be something that reminds me of him, or I'll just talk to him or whatever it is, right? I mean, there is no timeline on it. But the very, very important thing in terms of processing something as difficult as this is to allow yourself to receive support and lean on your support, to talk about it, to actually allow yourself to cry. If it's by yourself, that's fine. You don't have to do it in front of other people, right? But bottling all of that up is typically what leads to more problems in the long term. And so I just really, really, really want to normalize that this is an incredibly difficult experience. This is a true loss, and that it comes with a lot of pain and suffering in the aftermath.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'm wondering if it'd be appropriate to shift the ending with some positive reflections or memories, but then I don't want to jog jog the old the memories. But yeah, I'll maybe what pops into my mind is remembering like Kato, and I'll tell it's a goofy story about Kato, but like again for stress relief and maybe comic humor or comic relief for canine handlers or your future canine handlers out there is like a lot of dogs like they might be trained on the sleeve and the bite suit, but really don't want to bite people. We spent like hundreds, thousands of years domesticating these animals that aren't really like geared in to bite people. So I remember one specific one where, we had this robbery suspect, and he was this drunk guy, and he had a bunch of weapons on him. But I tried to deploy Kato on him, and he ran towards the guy like sprint, and then he slows down. The guy's just in the middle of the parking lot at this point. He's kind of stopped like looking at the dog, and he does this like really proper paw like prancing thing where his paws are really high, and he starts jogging around the guy in a full circle, almost as if he's just like, I don't see the bite suit, Dad. Like I don't see the sleeve. And he kind of circles back towards me in the car. I'm like, no, get that guy. I'm just saying, I'll just like about to lose my mind. Um, he didn't end up biting that guy. He learned it later. It's okay. We ended up being a at least semi-successful team. With some street cred, but that instance, at least, it was just me and my buddies having to effect that arrest, and while at the same time trying to corral my dog and make sure he didn't just wander off too far. But I will leave that just to lighten the mood a little bit.
That's a good story.
It's pretty good. It was not funny at the time. I about lost my mind. I think I had several sleepless nights following that. Like, are we ever gonna figure this out? Which again, it's a team. And it's just as much
Oh.
my ownership, but yeah, grateful for all of it.
Yeah. No, I saw you posted the video this morning of him eating the steak.
Yeah,
It's a nice big piece of steak you gave him
big
there.
piece of meat. Yeah, that was in his retirement. I started pampering him. Like he became, he
He
was
deserved
the
it.
yeah, he did. I mean, think about like all the times like close calls and like how you get again gratitude. Um, Not knowing how they would have ended had it had he not been there or had a different dog or a different team like it. Yeah, they weren't all wins, big wins, but we had several, and ultimately the fact that we all walked away from it, I would say big wins. So
Yeah.
but yeah, it became he was inside like on weekends, and then he was inside like well, in retirement all the time, as
There's a
as as
really
was
funny
earned.
video I recently watched of this guy who the Instagram video was basically that this guy, like, the writing was like, all right, I'll get a dog, but it's going to be an outside dog. And then
Mm,
he had the dog like sitting outside, and he had the sliding door closed, and then and then it clipped over, and he's like, all right, I'll open the door just so he can see what's going on. The dog had like his half of his body just laying inside. Okay, I mean, I don't want him to just sit out there by himself. So here's a little place I'm going to put him, and you put like a pillow down. But he's going to stay right here. He's not allowed in the rest of the house. And then basically it got to he had built him his own dog house inside the house, and he's like laying across him on the couch. Anyways, that just made me think of
yeah,
that.
I love it. I love it. I it did make it easier for me that like we would joke that he was a wild animal. He was like sable, so he's always like kind of splotchy black and brown. In the dark, he looked like a direwolf with a big
Oh,
old head. But yeah, he would just lay out in the rain, even when he had plenty of places to go for shelter. He just didn't care. He was like honey badger. So
wild boy.
yeah. Well, shoot, Brooke, we took quite the emotional roller coaster ride. Hopefully, people listening in aren't having to fight the cheers back, but let them,
And
don't fight
flow.
those cheers back, right? Like let it go.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but yeah, thank you so much for having this conversation and revisiting us. I'm certain on the next one, nearly certain that on the next one, it won't be as emotional of a topic to talk about. Even though we do talk about trauma, we talk about these very big topics, ironically. But this one, yeah, it just hits different. So I thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. And just to throw out there, I know Eric will put my info attached to this episode, but I do hold a week or a monthly virtual pet loss group for individuals. So I'm just throwing that out there. It's a resource for individuals who are looking for a community of people to just who are experiencing, that pain and that they can connect with. So just gonna throw that out there.
No, fantastic. And although it will be in the show notes, can you throw out your Instagram handle and your website? Because those will probably be the easiest ways that someone can, type that in.
Yep. So my website is centertas.com. That's centertas.com. And my Instagram handle is Dr. Brooke PhD.
Awesome. Thanks
Yep.
again, Dr. Brooke.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.